want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Another edition of On the Trail of Delusion. I'm Fred Litwin, and today we have another guest. We're going to try to separate the wheat from the chaff, separate reality from fiction, and give you something that's a little different from the typical conspiracy offerings you find on YouTube. Today my guest is an amazing guest. I've got Eric Dezenhall here, who is an amazing author. He's the author of 12 books of fiction and nonfiction, including Best of Enemies, The Last Grey Spy Story of the Cold War, written with my friend Gus Russo. Gus is an amazing guy.
He is. I love him like a brother.
Yep, he is amazing. So you know it's a good book. It's being made into a feature film, so I'm looking forward to that. And Eric founded one of the nation's first crisis management firms, worked in the White House with Ronald Reagan. So I'm sure there's some stories there. And right now, Eric is the author of this book, Wiseguys and the White House. It's just come out in January. I strongly recommend that everybody go and buy a copy. It's an amazing book. It tells the stories of several presidents and their relationship with the mob. There's a ton of really amazing stuff. And I am really happy to have Eric as a guest on the Trail of Delusion. So welcome, Eric.
Thanks for having me. I've been devouring your stuff ever since I found out about your existence, and I admire the patience you have with the conspiracy community, because I've given up debating people on it, and that's why in the Wiseguys book, I take the position I'm not going to litigate the Kennedy assassination. I'll just tell you what I think as an opinion, and you can do what you want. So that's how I came at it.
So what got you interested in the mob and this topic in particular?
Well, I tell a little bit about it in the book. The first book that I remember ever ordering was a book about the president. It was 1971. I would have been 9 years old, and it was one of those books that had 1 or 2 pages per president. The most recent president was Nixon, and I've been fascinated by the presidency ever since. When you overlay that on this, I grew up in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and it was not unusual to have a family member, a neighbor, a little league coach, a friend, somebody who was tied to the racket world in some way. I remember being 10 years old, and we snuck into The Godfather movie, and our neighbor Al Martino, there he was playing Johnny Fontaine. The Gambinos, and I don't mean just people in the Gambino family, I mean the actual Gambinos lived in our town. They were cousins of Carlo, and it was everywhere. But when you asked about it, you'd get shushed, and this, of course, had the effect of making it more interesting to a kid. And the story I open up the book with is I was 22 years old. I'm working in the Reagan White House. My boss says to me, "So you're from Cherry Hill?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, that's mafia. And yeah, I wasn't thrilled with that. But I went, well, yeah, it's been in the news a lot lately. There was a war with the Bruno family, an internal struggle with the Bruno family. And you also had the Pizza Connection heroin ring that was run by the Gambinos out of my town. And so she said, wow, the mob, they're pretty powerful. They run the country. They killed Kennedy. And I went, they did? And oh yeah. And I told the story in a recent book talk about freshman year in college, coming home on a break and running into a guy I grew up with who had been known to have gone to work with the Gambinos. And We ran in different circles. He was a tough kid. I was not a tough kid, but we liked each other. And we're outside of the Cherry Hill Mall. He gives me a hug. He goes, "Where you been?" And I said, "Been away at college." "Yeah, where?" And I said, "Dartmouth." He goes, "Where's that at?" And I said, "It's in New Hampshire." He goes, "Is that like Massachusetts?" And I said, "Yeah, that's like Massachusetts." And he had the Philly accent. He went, "They got an ocean up there?" And I said, "Well, yeah, New Hampshire's on the Atlantic." And he goes, "Atlantic? Is that like the one we got?" And I said, "Yeah, it's like the one we got." And I said, "Look, you want to go in and have a pizza?" And he goes, "No, Eric, I can't do that. Me and Vince just knocked out that security guard and took those stereos. We got to go." And I'm thinking, this is the guy who killed Kennedy? And so what has fascinated me for years, and what is the subject of my writing, a lot of it, is the gap between who we believe certain people and institutions are and who they really are. I made my living for 40 years in the crisis management business, and I am always amazed to go to a movie or a TV show and see a spin doctor as this omniscient genius who's calling up the New York Times or The Hague or the Supreme Court and saying, "You do what I tell you to do, or you'll deal with me." Oh my God, anything but that. This doesn't resemble the world that I've lived in. I've written about the CIA, as you said, with Best of Enemies with Gus. I see no evidence that they have the capabilities that they do in the movies. Um, I've gotten to know some mob characters really well and saw the inside of their lives. I have no evidence that they're capable of doing some of the things they're doing. Now, when I've said that, people who disagree with me saying, "Oh, you're just apologizing for the CIA and you're apologizing for the mob." Well, you have to listen to what I'm saying. I'm not saying mob doesn't kill people or that they're not thieves. I'm not saying that the CIA isn't involved with conspiracies. There are conspiracies. What I'm saying is what I don't think these characters are capable of is an immaculate conception that is massive in scope. I mean, you and I, Fred, can get together and decide, hey, let's write a fraudulent book with fraudulent sources and see who we can fool. That's a conspiracy. And maybe
Yeah.
we'll get away with it for a while. But I don't believe that we would be able to get away with it for more than 2 hours. And so I'm, as a creature of Washington and having worked in a White House, yes, the White House is powerful, but the idea that they are dispatching ninjas all over the world to destroy their enemies successfully, I just don't see it. And so this recurring theme of mine is this gap between fantasy and reality. And that's a lot of what I wanted to explore in this book, that gap between, all right, when my boss told me the mob ran the country, do they? And basically what I concluded is there was a time in our history where the mob was really quite powerful. But do they run the country? Come on. No.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I should tell you, I have a connection to Cherry Hill. In fact, I've been in Cherry Hill many years ago. My brother-in-law's sister still lives in Cherry Hill.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and so I was there like when I was like 10 years old, so we went and drove to Cherry Hill. So I was there. I had really no idea what any of it was about, but I just know we were there.
And your relative still lives in Cherry Hill?
Yep, yep.
Oh, okay. Well, that's well, maybe we can talk offline. I don't know whether we know them, but it's not a big town. But and by the way, I don't think its reputation of being a mob town is particularly fair. I think the accurate way to describe it is it was not unlike what you saw in The Sopranos. It was a middle and upper middle class suburban town where a handful, I should say, of executive level gangsters lived. It was not a violent place. It was not, I mean, I'm a kid from suburbia. It was not what you see in Goodfellas. There were a few mob hits there, but by and large, it was what you saw on the suburban level in The Sopranos. It was where they lived. I mean, I remember the Gambinos, they had a compound where they had two or three houses next to each other, and one of them had a stained glass G on the front door, but these were people you ran into who, at least as far as we saw, never did anything violent in front of us.
Yeah, in fact, I have a bit of a mob connection myself in that my best friend growing up in Montreal, Canada, um, his uncle, this is a Jewish family, his uncle was, I didn't know at the time, but was the go-between between the mob and the premier of Quebec, which would be the equivalent of the governor. And he
Hmm.
was the go-between, and he drove a Cadillac.
Hmm.
And which on our street, nobody had a Cadillac on our street, and he would show up, once or twice a month in his Cadillac. Nice, very nice man. I really, really liked him a lot. He was very, very friendly, a nice man. All I know is one time my mother told me, "Oh, there's an article in the paper, and he's mentioned with Meyer Lansky attending a meeting." Anyways, it's
Well, as you saw in the book, I have known Meyer's family for, I mean, I can't even tell you how long, and had access to his private records and his thinking, which we can talk about. And look, we had some characters too, but it goes way back. I was so far removed. I mean, one of the stories I tell in the book is my grandfather was in legitimate business of a man whose name I changed. I will call him Uncle Tony. And I didn't know until I was in my 20s that Uncle Tony had been the Don of Philly in South Jersey, who was in the car with Vito Genovese when he got arrested at the Appalachian Conference. And it was what was interesting to hear, because you read so much about Appalachian as a historical event, how these guys felt about that. And so much of what you see in mythology in the movies is some guy going, "Oh, you're not going to get me. I'm going to be out of here in 2 hours."
right.
The reality is these guys were absolutely mortified. It was, to use a Yiddish phrase, a shanda, and my family has both Italian and Jewish, that Uncle Tony was mortified. He was not a particularly violent character, apparently. It was a kind of a gambling uh, specialist. Vito Genovese, of course, was extremely violent, and he had felt horrified that he was going to be seen in his neighborhood as a gangster. He was upset that he had embarrassed the other people at Appalachian, because he was one of the catalysts for the meeting. And so this gets back to what's interesting to me. The mythology of the mob would be that someone like Vito Genovese would have no emotion, that he would, be laughing and saying, "Watch, I'm going to pull these strings to get me out of it." Well, that was not the case. He was horrified. It was viewed as a massive cock up.
Mm.
And and when if you saw the inside of Meyer Lansky's life, you would not conclude what one of the authors, there's an author named Hank Messick, who in one of the editions of his book about Meyer, the subtitle was "The Mob Runs America and Lansky Runs the Mob." Well, if you saw his apartment, if you saw his writings, these were not the markings of someone who believed he was running the world. This was the mindset of someone who felt besieged, who was certainly very powerful at one time in history. The
Right.
point here is not to say it's all myth, but if you look at his writings, if you look at the notes he made in books, this was someone who very much was trying to advance, who wanted to be legitimate. He was never able to make the turn, but every time he got close, because of his close relationship with the Genovese family and Luciano, they came after him. The rap on Meyer was they could never get him because he was too smart. The reality was the feds were chasing, in the 1960s and 70s, the Meyer Lansky of the 40s and 50s.
Hmm.
And Meyer Lansky in the 1950s really was Meyer Lansky. By the time we got to the mid 60s, the reason that they couldn't get him is he wasn't doing the things they thought he was doing.
Hmm. So true. I'll read you one quote, and I guess this relates to what you've just been talking about. One quote from your book is, you talk about presidential politics, organized crime. I had seen enough to believe that both could do bad things, but were constituted by certain limitations, such as the laws of physics and probability.
There you go.
And I think that's a really, really important phrase. I mean, of course, I see this with the CIA, where people think you have this super agency that, a flick of a switch could do almost anything. When in fact, the reality is they're a bloated bureaucracy that does all sorts of cock-ups like anybody else.
Well, that's why I have been such a fan of your work, because a lot of the nut of what you get to, and for the record, I am not a Kennedy assassination expert.
Yeah.
I don't purport to be able to parse every detail the way somebody like you can, or like Gus can. What I know a good deal about it, but I made my living for 40 years. I'm retired from my day job, but I had a crisis management firm. We worked with clients. I mean, I was basically in the conspiracy business. I worked with some of the largest corporations and institutions in the world that came under fire. There is no question that some of them did bad things, but what became very clear to me is the nature of a conspiracy. First of all, what people assume incorrectly is they hold the James Bond model, where there is a villain at the top and the villain gives an order, and thousands of people who dress exactly alike carry out those orders loyally. I see no evidence that happens. What often happens in the conspiracies, and what I actually think happened with Watergate, is people know what the boss wants. And in order to impress the boss, they take it upon themselves to go out and do something that they shouldn't be doing. And what I always tell people about corporate scandals is they are not vertical, they're horizontal. So everybody knows the boss wants us to make numbers. And Fred and I are in the office next to each other. And I go into Fred and I go, Fred, I don't think we're going to make these numbers. And Fred says, Eric, I don't think we are either. Just this once, we're going to go into the boss and we're going to tell him we closed that deal and everything's good. Well, just once then turns into a snowball. And so what you have is two morons genuinely do conspire to do something bad.
Right.
But at some point, it doesn't sustain, because at some point we're going to have to go down to the hall and involve Sally, and Sally is going to see risk, and she's going to go to the feds, or she's going to go tell somebody else. And one of the funniest things that I've noticed about mobsters and spies, they're the worst gossips I've ever met in my life. I have had mobsters tell me about murders. I've had CIA people tell me about secrets that they shouldn't be telling me. I've had psychiatrists tell me about famous patients. And this is, this is what I see as the norm. And your work on the Kennedy assassination, it's not just that you get into granular detail. It is that you have an understanding of human beings as they are, and organizations as they are, as opposed to as they are in the movie. I mean, movies, I just watched a few days ago by happenstance, the movie Michael Clayton with George Clooney. And it has kind of a fixer character. Hollywood loves fixers. And there's a great scene where two assassins have to eliminate an inconvenient attorney. And they're amazing. They go in dressed in black and they have the hair nets and they inject something between his toes. And of course he dies and everybody thinks it's suicide or something like that. This came up again, this concept, when the CEO of the healthcare company was killed a few weeks ago. And people called me and went, "Oh, do you think it was a professional hit?" And I said, let me stop you. The international assassin is a fabrication of Hollywood. The idea that billionaire Fred has lunch with billionaire Eric and says, we really have to do something about this guy, Joe. And I say, Fred, I've got a great hitman for you. I'm going to put you in touch. The idea fails on its face because this guy would be rolled up in 3 seconds. Your average hitman in terms of sheer statistics is Newman in Seinfeld. It is a moron living in his parents' basement in his 40s, ordering T-shirts from Amazon that say Navy SEALs on them. and he will be caught and he will go to jail. Then we move to mafia hitmen. Mafia hitmen are not international contractors they bring in from another country. Having spoken to them, they're very candid about how it worked. I spent time with one guy who was with the Philadelphia organization. He goes, Eric, how it happens is your boss says, I need you to take care of something, and this will be a way for you to move up. They're not paid, and they do it. And one of the conversations we got into was this business of, gangland style executions, as if they have a manual that says, we have to do this gangland style. So that's 2 shots with a 22 behind the ear. And what he said is, we use what we have to use to be able to get away with it. If it has to be quiet, we strangle them. If, in the days before video cameras, they shoot them and they would prefer a revolver because they don't jam. Then you get into CIA assassinations, and having talked to some of the guys who've been involved with those, they say what you do is, if you have a problem overseas, you find somebody in the opposition military in that country and you mobilize them to do what they do. It's not like in Langley, Virginia, which is a couple miles away from me. There is a basement, and they say, well, this guy, Joe, in Omaha, he's becoming inconvenient. All right, Victor, we need you to go out there. And he goes, okay, I'll get my best equipment. And he goes into this room. I'm not saying there was never an international assassin. What I'm saying is Occam's razor says that these characters, if they have ever existed, have existed very, very rarely.
Yeah, it's a good point. Let me ask you, and again, I don't know that much about the mob and the mafia, but it seems to me, and one of the things I talk about the JFK assassination, it seems to me that a lot of people in the mob felt themselves to be loyal Americans.
Well, yes, and I'm sorry if I cut you off, but
Yeah.
one of the reasons that Meyer Lansky's family, and by the way, his family is somewhat fragmented. I don't claim to have known everybody in his family and am friendly with anybody, but there is a wing of the family that have been very good to me and have been good friends. One of the reasons they cooperated with me is Meyer very much wanted the story told of his involvement in the World War II effort to hunt down Nazi sympathizers and saboteurs in New York. And the USA Today version of that story is the ship, the Normandy, caught fire a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. Nazi sabotage was suspected. The Navy couldn't get cooperation from the Italians on the dock because a lot of the Italians resented the fact that they were called enemy aliens, and that they resented being accused falsely of being loyal to Mussolini. The prosecutors said to the Navy, yeah, but there's another guy you should talk to get to Luciano, and that's Meyer Lansky. Meyer coordinated this program with the help of the Navy, got Luciano's involvement, and they allowed the Navy to work along the docks to create an early warning system to basically make life hard for Nazi saboteurs. Meyer very much was proud of that. He had tried to enlist in the army. He was rejected because of his age. He was 40 in 1942, and because of his height, he was max 5'4". He valued his contribution. He valued it so much that he sent his son Paul to West Point and and then when it was time for Patton to make a move on Sicily, brought the contacts back to the Navy, Sicilians, so they could help with making of the maps. And the reason why this is relevant to the presidency is Roosevelt wanted this done. A lot of the New York area activity was run by his best friend, Vincent Astor, who personally took care of him when he was stricken with polio. And Walter Winchell was the main propagandist for Roosevelt. And guess who his next door neighbor was in the majestic apartments in New York? It was Meyer Lansky.
Huh.
And so there were a number of connections to the White House, but a lot of these guys very much wanted to be seen as Americans. Albert Anastasia volunteered for military combat. One of the top guys in the Genovese family, Matty the Horse Ianello, and Benny Eggs Mangano were war heroes. But this didn't stop them from subverting American law. But they were very happy to participate in that, although Luciano was not particularly excited to be cooperating on this program unless he got something in return. And he ultimately did.
Well, that's interesting. And so moving on to my interest in JFK. Of course, the mob comes up all the time with JFK, and in fact, your chapter on JFK is one of the longest.
Yes, it is.
Book. It's a fantastic chapter. I didn't even know where to start, but first off, I couldn't believe that basically Kennedy Sr. was not really a bootlegger.
No, he wasn't. And one of the basic takeaways from the book is the people who knew how to use the mob fared better than the mob. And the reason Joe Kennedy wasn't a bootlegger is because he didn't need to be. Joe Kennedy did not particularly love being Irish. He did not like the fact that the Irish were identified with alcohol and alcohol abuse. He did not want to deal with Italians. He really didn't want to deal with Jews, who he called, his code name for them were Canadians, because he didn't want to sit there and curse Jews. So he said, those Canadians. Joe Kennedy was in the liquor business, and he was able to walk that line just like the Annenbergs, which I talk about, and Lou Wasserman and the Bronfmans. And Donald Trump. They were able to dance along that line where they did not do anything that in their time was provably illegal. For Joe Kennedy to be a bootlegger would be like Warren Buffett in 1989 decided to run a drug cartel. Why? He was making money, a fortune legally in banking, real estate, Hollywood, and most of all, insider trading, which was legal at the time. And so what he did was he did buy liquor companies. His business partner was somebody named James Roosevelt, who had an interesting father, the President of the United States. Another one of Joe Kennedy's partners was Winston Churchill in one of his ventures. He was able to buy things legally, and when it came time to exploit his ownership of liquor businesses, he did so legally. Now, is it possible that he transshipped some liquor and gave it and transferred it off the shores to bootleggers? That may have happened, but again, why would you enter a business with violent people when you're Mark Zuckerberg and you're making a fortune legally? Why would you do it? However, the evidence of Joe Kennedy being a bootlegger, it's always the same. It started with gangsters who were resentful that they could never make the turn to legitimacy. It is true that Joe Kennedy sold one of his businesses legally to a company that was partly owned by Abner Longy Zwillman, a mobster from New Jersey. And so there were mob ties, but he was not a bootlegger. But you tell people that, and it's like the equivalent, to your interest of the JFK assassination, if you want to destroy a dinner party, just say that Oswald did it. People will lose their minds. If you want people to lose their minds, say Joe Kennedy was not a bootlegger. The angriest anybody has gotten at me for anything I've said about organized crime is one time I did a radio interview and somebody called in and said that Tony Accardo of Chicago was more powerful than the president of the United States. So I went, no, he wasn't. And another time in an interview, I had said Meyer Lansky did not die with a $300 million fortune. You would have thought that I kind of came out and endorsed beating up old people.
Right.
It freaks people out. But no, Joe Kennedy was not a bootlegger.
So tell us a bit about the relationship of the Kennedy family and the mafia, and maybe a little bit about the 1960 election.
Well, the 60 election is interesting. First of all, I think people assume the Kennedys were all one unit. They were not. You had Joe Kennedy, who is this old tough guy who has no trouble crossing lines and dancing along the lines. And then you've got two rich kids in Jack and Bobby. I have seen no credible evidence that Jack and Bobby had anything to do with dealing with the mob in 1960. Did Jack know them? Of course, from Las Vegas. He shared a girlfriend with Sam Giancana. He partied with these guys. He hung with Sinatra. Joe Kennedy knew gangsters from he gambled in Meyer Lansky and Jimmy Alo's casinos in South Florida. He likely had an interest in a racetrack in Florida. He may have been a silent owner of a hotel casino in Reno. He had to deal with the mob in Chicago as the owner of the Merchandise Mart. And look, it was a cost of doing business. If you wanted to be in certain businesses, you had to deal with those guys, just like Trump had to deal with them as a real estate developer in New York. But what I believe happened, and by the way, Gus talks about some of this in some of his books, what Jimmy Alo, and by the way, for those who don't know that name, if you saw the movie The Godfather 2, there's a character, Johnny Ola. He is the partner of Hyman Roth, who's a stand-in for Meyer Lansky. Jimmy Alo, Ola, they just reversed the letters in the movie. His family has been a great source of cooperation to me. And Jimmy lived in my grandmother's building. And one of the things that he would tell people is, yeah, Joe Kennedy came to him and said, look, we just got done with Cuba. We're exhausted. I mean, Meyer had spent a month in the hospital, nearly died. They wanted to lick their wounds, relax, figure out where they were going to go next. They were in no mood. And also, I should say that Meyer felt terribly burned in the 1932 election because he backed, with Luciano and Frank Costello, Franklin Roosevelt, who promised he would lay off the mob, which, of course, once he got their support from Tammany, he then turned around and attacked the mob. And Lucky Luciano was asked later in life how he felt about being stabbed in the back by Roosevelt. And he said he was a no good, shit ass double crosser. But of course, I would have done the same thing. It was a good move. So Joe goes to Jimmy Alo. He says no. And Jimmy says, talk to your friend Frank Sinatra, who Jimmy didn't like. And Sinatra hooked Joe Kennedy up with Giancana, probably through a series of fronts. There are a few versions of this, and there is no question in my mind that the Chicago outfit helped get votes in Illinois, in New Jersey, in West Virginia. They distributed walking around money. Where things get interesting, Fred, is just because they helped doesn't mean they turned the election. This is something we don't know. And a lot of the points that I make in the book is, cynics of the World War II Luciano programs will say it's all bullshit. The mafia didn't win the war for America. No, but I didn't ever say that they did.
Right.
They were called upon and they helped. The mafia was called upon for help. I think that Giancana figured, look, I can't stand the Kennedys. I don't trust them, but maybe the father will sit on the sons, because the two of them are coming after us. Let's try it. And, if it doesn't work out, we'll have some dirt on, maybe we'll get some dirt on them anyway. And so I think that they did help. JFK won. I am unpersuaded that they turned the election for JFK, but they got help. And I think that's enough to make the point I was trying to make, that they were called upon for help and they did help. Giancana certainly believed that they helped, and they did help.
Right. I think also Joseph Kennedy had a stroke right out soon after JFK became president, and that sort of took him out of the picture a bit. So that important go-between was cut off between,
and he couldn't. That's right, and he was unable to sit on his sons. And there was a fight, according to one of the Kennedy sisters, between Joe and Bobby, saying, this is during the McClellan hearing, saying, you're out of your mind. We might need these people someday. What's with you? And Bobby Kennedy, he really truly was a mob buster. That's why you can't say, with a sweeping notion that the Kennedys were in bed with the mob. It depends which Kennedy you're talking about and which program in history.
So and that brings up the whole story of Robert Kennedy. So tell us a bit about his actions against the mob while he was Attorney General.
Well, I mean, he served as the chief counsel on the McClellan Committee, where his brother served as senator. And Bobby Kennedy, as far as I'm concerned, really was a pioneer in racket busting. I think that he really catalyzed a lot of it. He hated them. And he specifically hated them and their influence in the labor area. To him, Hoffa and Giancana were the worst of all. As Attorney General, not only did he not go light on the mob, he stepped up prosecutions. And so the mafia genuinely did hate Jack and Joe, and I have little doubt that they did feel that they made a bad investment in 1960, and I think that they were angry. But it doesn't mean that they're going to kill the president. And I think that there were any number of other things that they could have easily done if they were to prosecute a campaign like that. But I think where things get tricky is in the efforts to kill Castro. That's where we get really murky. But Bobby Kennedy was surely a mob buster, and Joe
So
did not succeed in sitting on him.
right, so here you have Robert Kennedy is the mob buster, and what I find interesting is that his brother is having an affair with Sam Giancana's girlfriend Judith Exner. And it seems to me that if one way to get rid of Kennedy would be to expose that relationship, and yet
There you go.
Hoover didn't expose it. He actually stopped the relationship. That would have been an easy way to get rid of Kennedy rather than killing him.
Well, of course it would. And I think that Hoover found out about the relationship, and he approached Bobby. And by the way, I'm grossly oversimplifying in order to keep things flowing. He confronted Bobby. Bobby knew his brother had a zipper problem, and he knew about this relationship, and it was just something he accepted as a flaw. Hoover pointed out to Bobby that this was not a smart relationship, and Hoover really wanted to go after civil rights people like Martin Luther King, and Bobby wanted to go after the mob, and Hoover had no interest in going after the mob for reasons we can get into that are different from what a lot of people think. And they basically had a deal where Bobby said, I'll let you go, I'll let you wiretap Martin Luther King if you help me out on the mob front. And I agree with you. The relationship with Judith Exner is unwise. You know that I'm not that kind of guy. And by the way, I don't believe Bobby Kennedy was. I mean, I'm not sold on the Marilyn Monroe stories. I mean, I wasn't there, but I think Bobby Kennedy had a puritanical streak. I don't think Jack Kennedy did. But where the conspiracy theories begin to bother me is the idea that Jack Kennedy was stuffing briefcases filled with cash, giving them to Judy Exner for her to take to Sam Giancana. No, I find that to be absolutely absurd. And this is an example of where people can take a kernel of shady stuff, which is true, such as this terribly unwise relationship, and take it to Hollywood proportions, where Jack Kennedy is saying, yes, I need more $100 bills to jam in this, to have Judy fly over there. I don't think it happened.
That's not bad. Well, and you talk
Maybe I
about
have a second career.
yeah. I'll tell you about Bobby Kennedy. I mean, I was really impressed with Gary Wills's book, The Kennedy
Hmm.
Imprisonment.
Hmm.
And he says much the same thing, that Bobby was the guy who didn't fool around, and he,
Hmm.
and that was very, very impressive. So we'll just don't want to talk about too much about the Kennedys and the mob, but okay, so what happened with Castro and the Kennedys and the mob, and what really went on there?
Well, Cuba was a very fraught situation because it was a strategic issue, and it was also one of American masculinity. It was the communists saying, not only are we going to keep expanding around the world, we're going to come right up to your face and wave it in your face, and we're going to do it in Cuba. What are you going to do about it? that was the problem with Havana. Meyer truly tried to put a hit out on Castro. He talked to the CIA about the dangers of Castro taking over. Obviously, the mob lost that fight. Meyer lost his legitimate fortune. Everybody wants to know, oh, where did Lansky hide his money? The answer is actually very simple. He put most of his money in Cuba, believing that would be a legitimate place where the mob could legally control hotels and casinos. It didn't work out so well.
Right, yeah.
Um, and you talk to members of his family, and they'll tell you it's not a mystery where the money is. And cynics would then say, "Oh, but he hid it in Swiss bank accounts around the world." Well, let me tell you something. Jewish fathers who take a vacation away from their racket activity and move their headquarters to another city at the height of their power, where their handicapped son, so he could be near the hospital where his handicapped son is being treated, don't leave no money for that child to die in a down market institution, which is what happened to Meyer's son, Buddy. And to be clear, Meyer once did have a lot of money, but he couldn't sustain it. So there wasn't money. And having dealt with cases involving the Justice Department, the idea that the Justice Department can come after you and you can hide money all over the world and they'll never find it. No, you make an enemy of the federal government, they will ruin you. They will take you down hard. So what happened is they wanted a Castro out of Cuba. And under the Eisenhower administration, they came up with a program to get rid of him. One element of the program was assassination. And the Eisenhower people, under his CIA, approached the mafia through John Roselli, Giancana, Santo Trafficante, and they said they weren't thrilled about it, but they said, "Yeah, we'll help you out." What's interesting is whether they gave it their best is another subject. There's no doubt in my mind that attempts were made to kill Castro. I don't know that they were impressive attempts. Now, here's where Bobby comes in. When Bobby learned that the mob had been used, because he was adamant about killing Castro, and I have quotes from a number of very serious people. These are not anonymous sources. These are rather serious people in our history saying, Bobby wanted Castro dead. And he was riding us and calling us losers and failures because we couldn't get it done. And somebody said, well, we've been trying, Bobby, and we've used these mob guys, and Bobby lost it. I don't want you using the mafia. And over a period of a few years, what happened was there were a number of different programs to try to kill Castro, including but not limited to the mafia. And what the CIA basically ended up saying is, Bobby, listen to me. You want this guy dead, but you only want us to use the nicest people to do it? And what ended up happening, I think, is that Washington dance where he knew, but he didn't know. And people who believe the Kennedys would not do such a thing say would not prosecute the mob over here and use them over here. My response is, why not? I mean, this is a very treacherous world. Right. I mean, the mob world and the spy world. I have lunch with Fred, and Fred, give me a big hug. You're my best friend in the world. And you don't know that I've just planted drugs in your house. This is that world. And so while I don't believe Bobby Kennedy was the author of the mob program to kill Castro, I think he bit down hard and looked the other way. And it didn't succeed. And I think he had a lot of feelings of guilt, wondering, did his participation in the Castro effort boomerang in some way on his brother? And my friend Gus has spoken, more brilliantly about that than I could.
Gus's book, Brothers in Arms, is a fantastic book.
Yeah.
I mean, really, really a very important book that people should read. So are you saying that Robert Kennedy knew that there were the CIA was working to kill Castro?
Oh, absolutely.
And did his
I
brother know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, there's a quote in the book where his brother sat down with, I believe it was a New York Times reporter, and said, "Let me ask you something. What do you think about the option of killing him, Castro?" And the reporter kept it quiet for a while, but there are a number of quotes from high-ranking Kennedy administration people saying, yeah, they wanted it done. They were not involved with every detail, and Bobby specifically wanted it done. Bobby Kennedy developed these villain voids that needed to be filled, and Castro was one of them. And I don't think it was, he was a hardcore anti-communist, but I also think that there's something in human nature that we need somebody to hate. And a lot of what communism represented in Cuba was an emasculation of President Kennedy. He couldn't allow these people to be sitting a few miles off of Florida, you know, doing that.
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that so many JFK conspiracy theorists are so adamant that oh, the Kennedys didn't know, they had no idea, they were totally shocked, they would have been against it, and when you look at Operation Mongoose, the Kennedys were so anxious to get rid of Castro that they asked every element of the government come up with ideas, come up with plans. And everybody came up with these incredibly weird, stupid, idiotic, but everybody came up with a plan, and I listed some of them in my blog. And then the Pentagon comes up with Operation Northwoods,
Which is the most insane thing ever. And
right? Which is,
thank God they killed it.
yeah, completely insane. It wasn't like the Kennedy administration was, oh my God, how could you do this? It was like, look, we're not going to do this, but yeah, we wanted you to come up with a plan. And I thought it was interesting. Operation Northwoods came back twice. I mean, the second time it came back to Kennedy, it was actually authored by Maxwell Taylor.
Part of the problem with writing about controversial things is trying to separate yourself from your religion. And I think that whether we're talking about the Kennedys or Trump, there is a religious component that seeps into it. And look, I grew up worshiping John F. Kennedy, and the reason why, I mean, even though I was born in 1962, there was a romance. I mean, I would love to tell you that I understood policy as a kid. I didn't. What I understood, which is not a good reflection of my own intellect, they were beautiful, they were young. The idea that the world could be better, and then Vietnam and all of these horrors followed it. It is just more desirable to believe they would have ushered in all this good. And then I grew up. And I also worked in the White House, where a lot of the things that I saw and were hoping were true about politics turned out not to be. And I had to grow up. When you're talking about the Kennedys, you have people of a certain generation. You have people of a certain generation who have a religious devotion to that era. And I think that it's fully possible that they were wonderful about some things and not so wonderful about other things. The one thing that I think your listeners or viewers should understand is, in terms of the mafia and the Kennedy assassination, is I believe that the proof of a CIA or mafia plot is the lack of evidence. Because we have nothing, that proves that they were that good. And I don't see any evidence in 60 years that they were that good. And I also don't think, if you listen to the wiretaps from that era, they had the mob wired up, and there's nothing about the Kennedy assassination. They got nothing other than some of the guys were happy about it, and a number of them, what they said, and this is very critical, is, my God, they're going to think we did it. Do you know what they're going to do to us? Because one of my guys shoved an FBI agent and they beat him within an inch of his life. one of the things these guys, what they wanted was to steal as much as they can steal without getting killed or going to jail.
Right.
This is why they don't kill cops. This is why they don't kill reporters. They're going to kill the president of the United States, whose brother is the sitting attorney general. I have worked on cases in my career where my clients have come up against organized crime. And in one case in particular, the CEO heard they were up against the mob, and he said, no, we're going to go after them. I'm going to use my contacts in the Justice Department. And this CEO used his contacts, and dozens of people went to jail. They destroyed them. It wasn't even a fight. And there is no comparison between the federal government and the mafia. And yes, the mafia was very powerful, but not against the federal government. There were any number of things they could have done to get rid of Kennedy. Killing him is not one of them. That's an important takeaway.
Yeah, very, very good point. I think, and like I say, they could have killed him, but they never could be sure they can get away with it. And if you can't get away with it, there's no use to killing him.
No, and no, absolutely not. So that's an important thing for your fans.
Yep, that's very, very true. Tell me, I mean, you talked a bit about the Kennedys were good looking, and we had the same experience here in Canada with Justin Trudeau. I mean, Justin Trudeau ran for prime minister, and he was this really good-looking guy, and he was young, and he was like bringing us sunny ways with a big smile, and it's going to be amazing. And we elected him, and after like 9 years, like, oh my God, this is what a huge mistake it was. So yeah, tell me a bit about the Reagan White House.
In terms of the Reagan White House, back in the first election I voted in was 1980. And back then there wasn't much difference between a Sam Nunn or Scoop Jackson Democrat and a Chuck Percy, Howard Baker Republican. I'm a middle guy. And so to me, okay, it wasn't that I was an acolyte of Reaganism or something like that. I was a 22-year-old with an amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
And the man who ran the communications operation, to Dave Gergen and Michael Deaver, and this was a great place for a kid to get his entrance into the world of Washington. Among the things I learned is that politics is not what I thought it was. What did I think it was? I thought it was being charismatic and giving inspiring speeches. One of the things I learned in the White House was how cutthroat it was. And when somebody asked me why I didn't stay super long and why I went into the private sector, I said, I don't like this feeling of perpetually looking over my shoulder. And all of the conversations at my low level were who screwed up, who's so stupid they're going to screw up, who's smart enough to cover up screwing up. There was this obsession with whose office was closest to the Oval. And it was so irrational that, my little office, which was in the old executive building, which is next door, which is considered part of the White House complex, it were these big, beautiful, ornate offices, but nobody wanted those. They wanted the tiny little offices near the Oval. And this jockeying to get there, it was more, one of the things I learned at that time was I was ambitious, but I was not ruthless. And I think in order to stay in a White House and thrive, you have to be absolutely ruthless. The other thing I learned is that nobody can keep their mouth shut. And people who shouldn't be talking talk.
Yeah, a very, very good point. So, in this book, you cover a number of presidents, and there's just so many, interesting stories. I mean, you talk about the Reagans and Johnson. So what other president really was one that really struck you as interesting when it comes to the mob?
Well, there were a few that really jumped out. First of all was Harry Truman, who's probably my favorite president, somebody who was thrust into an extraordinary situation. Harry Truman would not have been president without the mob. What is fascinating is biographies of Truman, as thorough as they are, they really give short shrift to the mafia. And the Kansas City machine was a mafia-controlled machine. And by mafia, I mean Cosa Nostra. I don't mean the colloquial, you know, you hear people talk about the Velvet Mafia or the Irish Mafia. No, this was Cosa Nostra. And it was an Italian organization, Italian dominated, and they selected Truman to run for Senate. And what's interesting is I don't believe that Harry Truman ever took money from them. What he did was he benefited by having career advancement. And one of the things he did was he would privately say, including in his private diaries, sometimes I had to let gangsters steal. I didn't like it. But if I'm going to get stuff done over here, I have to look the other way over here. He didn't publicize it, but he recognized it as a reality. And I call Truman in the book the most mob relevant president because his career simply wouldn't have happened without it. Interestingly, it started to catch up with him while he was president. And one of the reasons I think he didn't run in 1952, which was around the time the Kefauver hearings started, was there started to be a lot of noise about his origins. And he knew that it was true. He was also exhausted from various wars. They started digging into his family. His wife was getting payments, they were legal from the Senate. They started calling her payroll Bess. And they started asking questions about his roots. After all, he attended the funeral of his mentor, Pendergast, who was basically a gangster. He to the point where when the Don of Kansas City was shot, he was lying in the street before he died and said, tell Mr. Pendergast I love him and he'll always be my friend and partner. And Truman, two gangsters were gunned down in front of a giant photo of Truman in the Democratic Club in Kansas City. So here you have a president who I think was a good president, who I don't think was corrupt, who got his start with the mafia. Other things that are interesting to me is especially relevant now, and I promise I won't get into partisan politics, but Trump, in that, one of the things Trump says that drives people crazy when he's accused of something naughty, he says, that just makes me smart. And he actually may be right, because if you look at how he dealt with the mafia, it's not provably illegal. And how he dealt with the mafia were two ways that were interesting. Number one, if you picture a building going up in Manhattan, you probably picture steel and cranes. To build Trump Tower, he used concrete, not steel. Steel is an international industry. Concrete at that time was controlled by two concrete companies in New York run by the Gambino, Colombo, and Genovese families. What did Trump do? He simply paid them well, and he got labor peace. There is no law that says you are not allowed to pay a legal concrete company well. He also did things like in my home area of Atlantic City is when he needed help from the mob, he would pay a premium price for real estate that they owned legally. So there was a guy, a big mobster. I don't know whether you're a Springsteen fan, but there's a song called Atlantic City. They blew up the Chicken Man in Philly last night. The Chicken Man was Phil Testa. His son Salvi Testa owned a piece of property worth $195,000. Trump, through a front, paid $1.1 million for it. Now, a prosecutor friend said to me, "No, but Eric, that's illegal. If he did that and you could prove he got something in return, that's illegal." And I said to my friend, it's been 45 years. Nobody's proven anything. The mob guys, some of them went to jail for this stuff. Nobody ever suggested Trump did anything illegal. So here we are 45 years later. If Donald Trump, whether you like him or not, and I'm not an enthusiast by any stretch of the imagination, when he says he was smart to do things the way he did, he's actually right. He has been on David Letterman saying he dealt with the mob. He is very, very open about it, and in fact has made it part of the mob boss shtick as part of his brand. Not only hasn't it hurt him, it's helped him. This is very interesting to me. And I think that it tells you how much, at some level, we in this country kind of think the whole mob thing is kind of cool.
Yeah, that's very, very true. I, myself personally, I wouldn't mind if we had a Ronald Reagan or a Harry Truman today.
Well,
You know,
yes, a lot of us feel that way, and I, we're just dealing with very different times, and different things are going to be done to do it. But a number of these presidents had contacts. I mean, the president I worked for, his career was sponsored, basically created by Lou Wasserman, who was his agent, and Lou Wasserman helped get labor peace in his business over the years with help from the Chicago outfit. Does that mean that Ronald Reagan was sitting down with the Chicago outfit members? No, but an amazing thing that his career was sired by someone who was so close to the mob. And when Reagan became president, while he did prosecute the New York mob, the ones that were associated with Los Angeles and Chicago were let off light. And I interviewed a few of the prosecutors who said, yeah, they believe that the Reagan's Justice Department did not want to look at certain things.
hmm. Well, that is interesting. So tell me, these days, is there still a mob, or are we just left with Russian and Vietnamese and Chinese gangs? What's the status today?
Well, there is a mob. They're a husk of what they once had been, and a lot of that is because of the RICO laws, which get you into trouble, which multiply punishment for just being involved with a criminal enterprise. The second thing that's really bad for them is surveillance. There is so much audio and video surveillance that, I mean, one former hitman I spent time with said he couldn't do what he did in the day. He just couldn't do it. There would be no way to get away with it. And so they're not as violent. And the other thing I think is there are legal ways to do certain things that didn't exist years ago. I mean, now in politics, you can make massive contributions legally to politicians in some way or another. Why would you have to meet them in an alley and bribe them when you could give one of their family members a big business contract? And so there's other ways to go about it. And so do I think the mob is dead? No. But I just think that there are alternatives. Human nature hasn't changed, but I think that Darwinism has killed off a certain way of doing business and has been replaced by other things.
Well, I mean, the other thing is you also can turn to electronic crime, which can be very, very lucrative and done in your own home.
Well, it can be. And also, I think you need people who have the intellect and training to do it. And one of the things I found about some of these old time mafia guys, is they didn't have a lot of options. I mean, Jimmy Alo tried to get a job in an investment bank, but because he was Italian, they didn't let him be anything more than a messenger, and he ran out and he robbed the bank, and that started everything. Meyer Lansky grew up in horrible circumstances. I don't think you have to be a mobster now. I think where you see it being very tragic is when I've talked to people involved with black gangs. A lot of them, they have the same trouble that Irish and Italians and Jews had at the beginning of the 20th century, which is it's been harder for them to break out of their circumstances for reasons we don't have to get into, but
Right.
that we
Yeah.
know. And I have one friend who got out of that life. He's just as smart as anybody I ever know. But what do you do when you're brought up in a neighborhood in Northeast Philly where someone who is smart, the best thing they feel that they can do is become the business mind of the local drug gang? I think that that's going to change, and I think that at least with both the Italian and Jewish racketeers, they didn't. The Jewish guys certainly didn't want their kids involved, and the Italians, mob types that I grew up around, their kids were not in it.
I was even struck by one of the interviews you did with a hitman who said, I don't really like it.
Well, it's funny, I talked to him and I asked him, I said, I'm sorry to do this, and I don't want you to think I'm being obnoxious, but you killed 20, 25 people. How do you live with that? And he had a Philly accent, and he called me Irk. And he said, Irk, tell me about something about your job you don't like. And I said, I don't like traveling and being away from my family. He said, I didn't like killing people. And he didn't. He was not a bloodthirsty, Ted Bundy homicidal maniac. He was an enterprise criminal. He did it because it was part of business, and if he didn't do it, he would get killed himself. He was not bloodthirsty. He wasn't proud of it. He didn't strut around like a badass, but it was part of it. And I think that, one of the things that Lansky and Jimmy Alo's family will tell you is the reason they left New York to go to Florida was not just to open up casinos in South Florida and Havana. They didn't like all the killing.
Mm.
They did not like Vito Genovese, whose answer to everything was killing. They despised Dutch Schultz. Am I saying they weren't gangsters? No. Am I saying they were choir boys? No. They really wanted to get away from all of that. And you have gangsters and you have racketeers. Racketeers are enterprise criminals who want to make money, and they want to make the money illegally. They're not really interested in hurting people unless it gets in the way of commerce.
Hmm. So a couple last questions. I mean,
Sure.
First up, did you do much research on Carlos Marcello?
I did. He's very interesting to me, because he, of course, is fingered heavily in the Kennedy assassination stuff. And the man who started the Kennedy assassination mob rumor happens to be a guy I spent time with, a guy named Ed Becker. And Ed really was around a lot of these guys. And he started the whole rumor that Carlos Marcello said to him, I want to remove the stone from my shoe. What's interesting about Carlo, number one, Ed, even though he really did know these guys, Ed, like a lot of people who were in that mob world, never met a major world event he didn't have a hand in. And one of the things you have to be skeptical of when you write about this stuff is, if you meet a guy and you say, "Hey, how about that Julius Caesar?" and he goes, "Let me tell you, that wasn't Brutus and Cassius." What happened was Caesar was in 50 large he bet on the Chiefs. So my guy Joey Bag of Donuts had to take him out. You have to wonder about somebody who was involved with everything that happened. Whereas if you asked a Jimmy Alo or a Meyer Lansky, what do you know about this event? They go, how the hell do I know? I wasn't there. The higher up you go on the mob food chain, the more honest they are. The lower down, they all were involved. Carlos Marcello was highly legitimate by the 1960s. He was in a lot of legitimate businesses. I mean, I'm sure he was still involved with the mob, but he was not this hot-headed maniac people made him out to be. And Gus and I have talked a lot about this, the idea that Carlos Marcello, who didn't even speak Italian, would tell a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant he didn't know that well, yeah, I came up with this idea to kill the president. It just falls down on its face. And so I think Carlos Marcello was able to achieve what a lot of these guys wanted, which is to get some semblance of legitimacy so they could leave their family legitimate holdings. And a lot of what is interesting to me, and one of the conclusions, of the book, are the people who were able to use the mob did better than the mob. And so, you always hear people talk about, oh yeah, that guy was just a front in Vegas. Well, guess what? The front has stock certificates in their names. The guys who were behind them and controlled the power, they were still burying money in the backyard. And that's not so good. But Marcello is a really interesting guy, and I hope someday somebody writes a revisionist biography of him, because I don't think that he's this president killer people make him out to be.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, a bunch of my JFK buddies, we went to New Orleans, and we went to one of the cemeteries. We were looking for Jim Garrison's grave.
Hmm.
And so sometimes it's hard to find. So we're walking around the cemetery, and all of a sudden my friend Bill yells out, "Oh my God, here's Carlos Marcello's grave." And so we were there with Carlos. We eventually did find Jim Garrison's grave. Wasn't that far away. Not everybody in the mob is a killer, as you've said. I had a big argument with the producer, one of the producers of Rob Reiner's JFK series.
Oh, God.
And I was told him that Johnny Roselli was not a murderer.
Oh, well, I spent time with a friend of mine, Llewellyn Smiley. Her dad was Al Smiley, who was sitting on the sofa with Ben Siegel when he got killed. And Al was Ben Siegel's right-hand man and later John Roselli's right-hand man. And Roselli, I'm not saying he might not have been capable of violence in his youth, but if so, he hadn't committed an act of violence in probably 50 years. Same with Meyer Lansky. That was not what they were about. They brought something different to it, and a lot of what Roselli did is he was a facilitator. He brought people together. He was a lubricant in the engine of it, but he was very religious. And Llewellyn told me that one of the reasons he never got married and he had a vasectomy is he did not want to bring kids into a world that he thought was a disgrace. And he was always trying to make that turn to get out of it, but he was never able to do it.
That's very interesting. It was a horrible argument with this producer who just no, he's a deadly killer. How could you say this?
I've never seen the evidence of it, but what's amazing to me as somebody who spent a career in crisis management is that Jim Garrison, how loathsome what he did was, because one of the things I've seen in my field is once a certain narrative gets started, it's very hard to reverse it. And here was somebody who concocted this idea that had been around for a while of a gay cabal secretly doing these horrible things. In fact, there was a theory that I talked a little bit about in the book that communism was being engineered by a gay cabal. And here you have Harrison. That part never really took off, but here Harrison wanted to send a guy to jail because of it. And you would think that the political and cultural left would find this monstrous, but the Kennedy assassination, it's their religion.
Yep, you would think so, but instead, Oliver Stone had to go victimize Clay Shaw a second time. It's absolutely astounding. And I'll spend years trying to correct this, but yeah.
Well, you're very. I think that I'm not trying to blow sunshine your way, but I think one of the things you bring to it, in addition to relentless fact checking, I'm learning things whenever I get one of your mail. I thought I knew this stuff. I haven't even scratched the surface, given what you're finding. But you're able to do something that I have not been able to do at a lot of conversations, which is to remain very cool, because I just can't stand the conversation anymore, and I just won't fight it. Now, to the extent I deal with the Kennedy assassination in my book, what I felt that I owed the reader was an opinion. But what I don't do is I don't debate the facts, because I have friends who are very bright people who genuinely believe the CIA killed 70 people in the following years. And of course, no, they were so good, nobody could track them.
Yeah, really. They were just amazing. Well, look, thank you very much for agreeing to be on my podcast. I strongly recommend that everybody run out and buy a copy of this, or buy 2 copies. It makes a great gift for your friends. Eric Dezenhall's book is absolutely important, and so please go out and buy this. And Eric, thank you very much for appearing.
Fred, this was great. I continue to be a kind of a fanboy of yours, and keep sending me the emails on your research.
Thank you very much, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.